Over the last couple of years, I've noticed a huge trend where different modern Euro games often take classic mechanics and reinvent them and reshape them into new game experiences. It might be a twist on a worker placement game, or it might be a twist to card drafting or card usage, or maybe it is melding 2 or 3 of those mechanics together to create a new satisfying experience with a theme that maybe hasn't been addressed before. These are common things that designers and publishers are doing to try and push the envelope into design spaces to keep board gaming fresh and new all the time. And so it got me wondering over the last couple of years whether I'm someone who enjoys more modern Euro games or whether I'm someone who gravitates more towards the classic Euro games. Hi, my name's Danny. I'm an avid modern board gamer from Australia who loves sharing my passion for this hobby with you, my friends, and my family. Come and join me for this Talking Sanctuary video. Now, before I take a deep dive in comparing old Euros versus new Euros, I want to say that there is immense variety out there. There's no clear category of games that we can classify them as really old games and new games because it's almost like a transition. We started with these earlier board games and then they transitioned into more modern games, and those modern games have now pushed the envelope into other areas. Modern board gaming has changed and evolved so much over the last 10 years. So it's really hard to kind of pigeonhole them into 2 categories. What I do want to do is be able to compare games that are considered to be relatively classical and ones that are considered relatively modern. And I know that there's going to be different outlier games out there that are going to feel classical but are going to be modern, and there's also older games where they feel more traditional and they're still relevant today. So this is more a very general and thought-provoking approach to the topic. And I just wanted to lean into the idea that these classic Euros are ones that really set the benchmark for modern board game design. And so I want to start the conversation by trying to distinguish between the two. When you think of a classical Euro, the first board games that come to mind are Castles of Burgundy, Carcassonne, and obviously Catan. These are games that really set the benchmark for really fun game experiences that really involved players at the table and really brought that social dynamic to the table space. And so what a lot of these older Euro games have in common is that they are very highly interactive. In the fact that there was some sort of mechanism in the game that really forced players to contend with each other is something that's predominant in a lot of these old school games. So with Catan, it's about bartering and trading different resources to get the resources that you need. It might be something like Bora Bora, where you place a dice onto a particular action. If you place a lower valued die, that blocks the other players out from getting something that they need. There is a central mechanism that invites players to actually contend with each other, whether it's auctioning in Ra, or it could be drafting dice from Grand Austria Hotel to take advantage of a power that maybe other players might want to have, because the number of dice in the action column that you take from Grand Austria Hotel actually is the magnitude of the actions that you can take. So there is some sort of mechanism that invites players to kind of get into the arena, step into battle, but kind of do it in a more pleasant way. We've also got a lot fewer mechanisms. In a lot of these classic Euros, it is often very streamlined and pared back. You will often see maybe 2 or 3 main central mechanisms, and then maybe a variety of other smaller mechanisms or ways to score points. This kind of streamlining effect in a lot of the classical Euro games means that a lot of them are easier to kind of approach. They have a very distilled design around them, where there is one core concept that's really fleshed out. And if you think about games like Carcassonne, everything is revolving around a single square tile and where you place that square tile. That's simple to to learn kind of game structure or turn structure, but then the magnitude of that decision that you make in that decision space is actually very powerful. It has emanating effects and consequential effects on not only you, but also the other players. Another element of classical Eurogames that's apparent is the idea of hidden depth. There's a lot of simplicity to the choices that you make, but there's a lot of layers to what you're actually doing. And that all is infused by the game design itself. The DNA of the game actually creates scenarios and situations which actually challenges what you decide to do. Do you decide to, take a job tile in Puerto Rico, which every other player is going to get that action so that you can take a beneficial action that will advantage your play? Or will you choose the ship action to force other players to discard some of the goods they've acquired? Different players can approach the same puzzle, but from a different perspective. The idea that if I'm playing Carcassonne and I place my meeple somewhere, that is kind of announcing to the other players which sort of area I'm wanting to score in, whether it's the castle or whether it's, trying to build a connection of roads. And in Catan, it might be where I place my village and upgrade my city to take advantage of the doubling value of when a resource tile activates. And so if we look at modern Euro games and how they've evolved and where we are now, there are some pretty big differences. In games like Wingspan, where the theme is centered around inviting birds to your habitat and then using those bird powers to score points and tuck cards, modern Euros have a much more different approach to them. There is a stronger focus around engine building, the idea that you can use cards and resources to convert them into other things that help you to convert them into more things and to help you to create combos. Engine building is more a relatively newer mechanism or concept that modern board games have often tapped into. The idea that players have their own board so that you can almost just really play your own game away from the other players whilst you're still kind of engaged together socially at the table, you're interacting less. And so a lot of modern board games have probably a lot less direct interaction, because when people play Euros, one of the common features about a Euro is that it isn't very take that. People get really sensitive about their feelings when they play board games, and so a lot of Euro games encourage players to play multiplayer solitaire, where you're building your own tableau, doing your own thing, but you might be racing for the same objectives. These are common facets of modern board game design. There's a lot more focus these days on resource management, and that's not to say that classic Euros don't focus on resources, but here there's a lot more newer games where it's like, get this resource, convert it to another resource, take this action, use this resource. And so the economy of using different types of resources becomes more apparent in these modern Euro games. When you also look at modern Euro game designs and you look at the mixture of mechanisms that have been infused in these modern games, you'll often see that there's like a patchwork of different mechanisms that don't necessarily make sense when you strip the theme away, but then when you look at the theme, you can see why different mechanisms have been infused. In games like Ark Nova, a lot of it is card play, but then when you're building your zoo, you've got kind of these domino tiles that you place out on your board and you cover it up. And so there's a mixture of this kind of area puzzle as well as this card puzzle where you're trying to meet certain tags. And so that link between the two is a very modern thing to do, to kind of Frankenstein the game a little bit, where you're like, ooh, maybe if we use this card play and we interact it with worker placement, and that interaction of worker placement is linked to combat, that link to combat is also linked to area control, and whoever has the majority will win the game. So you can see how the lattice of different mechanisms, whilst not ideally all being related to each other on a mechanical level, by using it to express a theme or melding them together to give you a different sort of experience, is what modern board gaming does. And I guess the best way to describe this concept is when you think of your grandparents' favorite traditional recipes, whether it's spaghetti bolognese or a cake recipe. Your grandparents have a particular way of doing it, using the ingredients that they know best, that gives you those best flavors. And those ingredients are not necessarily going to change that much over time. A brownie is only going to have 4 to 5 ingredients. And so brownies are always going to be that way. But now what you're seeing is twists to those classical recipes. And so where does this ultimately leave us? Over the last 6 months, I've had this kind of turn in the way I feel about the board gaming hobby. I was like, you know, I entered this board gaming hobby in about 2015. It's now 2025. So I'm just like, well, what were the games like before 2015? What were the games like in that period when I was still, you know, an avid explorer in this hobby? I've been kind of looking to collect those classic games that kind of fit in these rectangular Alea style boxes. These sorts of games have really captured my attention again. It's almost like the renaissance of my interest in where these games started. And the more beige it is, sometimes the more excited I get, because I'm like, ooh, I wonder what made this game so exciting. I mean, if someone can literally publish a game that's completely like this shade of cream, then obviously there must be something worthwhile exploring in there. These days you see that there's a lot of overproduction on miniatures, components. I know there's this Puerto Rico campaign where it's like, let's take Puerto Rico and let's make it into a 3D miniatures experience. But you know what? I'm not really connected with miniatures. I'm actually more connected with the simplicity of wooden pieces and cardboard pieces, and having it slim enough that it's going to be able to fit on my shelf like a good classic book. If you were to ask me now whether I prefer modern Euros or classic Euros, at this point in time, as of filming this video, my answer would be the classic Euros. So you might be thinking, well, why classic Euros? They're 10 years old. Isn't the design of those Euros outdated? But you know what? For me, who's discovering these classic Euros for the first time and playing these games, it actually gives me another point of reference or another perspective as to where board game evolution has come from. And the mechanics were simpler, and yet they were very, very defined. You had simple turn structures. You had maybe 1 to 3 different things you could do on your turn, but the impact of those decisions meant that you had to really carefully think about what you were going to do. So they were very simple to learn, but hard to master. And that was the elegancy of a lot of those early Euro games. There's a lot of hidden depth and a lot of emphasis on the design of making a game feel elegant over having lots of fiddly bits that you had to kind of contend with. And Carcassonne is the epitome of simpler but defined, and the idea that you basically pick your tile and then you place it somewhere on this shared map. And the fact that everyone is building on this shared map of Carcassonne and trying to put their meeples down and score means that wherever you extend the landscape, you're not only trying to do it so that you can hopefully score one of your meeples that you've committed to, but also another player can kind of piggyback on what you've built. And so that shared depth means that your action has a potential consequential action for all the other players sitting at the table. The second thing I noticed about classic Euros is that they were more potent in terms of the things that you were actually doing. There were more focused avenues for pursuing different lines for victory, and there were lots of different options based on the choices that you made. There were a lot of interlocking mechanisms that kind of worked together that made sense, and then they were also quite mathematical as well. So for example, in the game Catan, there is a lot of maths behind the 2 dice that you roll and the probability and chance of rolling certain values. And so that kind of simulates, if you're obviously starting your own new civilization, the produce that might fluctuate between the different seasons. So in winter, you might not get enough of a particular resource, but in summer, you might get more. And so when you're rolling these dice kind of simulate the fluctuating nature of resources, making one resource more common, another resource more scarcer. And so that infuses into the decision of trying to go for those trade ports, upgrading certain cities so that, you know, if there is a rare number that's hard to roll, when you do get it, you might get double of that resource. That helps you to advance your gameplay. And then obviously the development cards, helping you to build your civilization to get to your 10 points to win the game. That's all infused into the maths of the game. Potent decision making. So for example, in Castles of Burgundy, you're rolling these 2 dice, yet the weight behind what you do with the value of the dice has 2 or 3 multiple effects. It might be determining which area you're going to be taking the next hex tile from, and you can modify the value of the die by using your little workers that can add or subtract 1, and then that die could also be used for placing a particular hex in a particular region that matches the die number. And if you want to increase the range of where that tile can go, then you obviously can use your dice modifiers too. And so there's a lot of potency behind the gameplay decisions. And you've got games like Glass Road by Uwe Rosenberg, which has this little time wheel mechanism where once you accumulate certain resources, the time will automatically clocks over and converts those resources into a higher value resource. And then you've got to use those to buy tiles, and the tiles have particular conversion abilities. And so everything feels interlocked. This decision you're making over here connects with that decision and the decision on the main board that you've got in front of you. So this brings me to my third point, that a lot of these classical Euros were really addictive. Like games like Puerto Rico, where that kind of indirect play interaction of what you take is going to help someone else is something that gets you kind of back to the game quite easily. And the fact that the game comes in a small box and is relatively easy to teach and play and learn and set up meant that the number of games you could get in for the weight of thinking and analytical thinking that you had to do in the game was very high. And so this great equilibrium of easy to learn, easy to access, easy rule set that all makes sense, and then also like the small setup factor meant that it was just played again and again and again. And that's why a lot of these classic Euros have kind of been at the top 50 of the Board Game Geek list for so long over these years. These are the sorts of games where you think, ooh, sounds really simple on the surface, but there's so much to explore. And so in games like Bora Bora, you've got this whole dice action selection mechanism, and then you're presented with this conundrum of you've got these 3 objectives and you've got to complete 9 objectives in the game, and if you don't complete an objective you don't get any points for it, but if you do you get 6 points. But everyone's trying to complete these objectives whilst trying to complete 6 other things at the same time. The ability to kind of lean in and try and go, you know what, this game I'm going to try and get the highest value jewelry. In this game I might try and settle across the entire island and make sure I get the fish points at the end of the game, or I might, you know, collect the male and female tiles and use them to my advantage to gain advantage in the turn order every round, and amp up the tattoo track to get more points every round. A lot of these games, because of their simplicity, have different little avenues for you to kind of come back and explore. What you'll see in a lot of newer modern board games, not all of them, just want to clarify that, is that just because you have more content doesn't make the game more replayable. In fact, having more there's lots of games actually that sit on my shelf where I've gotten additional content and I've just basically put the additional content in the box and never touched it, because I just haven't really explored everything in the base game. And some modern board games will allow you to do that. The idea that you can just enjoy playing the base game and never have to touch an expansion. A lot of these classic games, because they were smaller in their footprint, there was a lot more content infused in the different pathways you wanted to take. And so you can go, ooh, this last time I went for this particular scoring method, maybe I'll try an alternative scoring method. Discovering when you should time things well, how to sequence things to get the maximum value out of your actions. When I was younger and I used to play board games with my brother, we often used to love playing games that kind of punished the other player. We're like, ooh, I'm gonna take that money from you, or ooh, I'm gonna attack your creature. Modern board games have kind of moved away from that feeling of hurting another player. And so hurt feelings is something that kind of is a strong consideration that modern Euro game designs really take into account. Players don't really like the idea of building up to something for only the game or some other player to take that away from them. And so I think these classical Euros were probably not as shy as worrying about everyone's hurt feelings. So games like Catan, a player would be able to put the robber somewhere where you really wanted to be able to produce, and so that was like, and then you could make that player discard half their hand if they had too many cards, and then you get to take a card. Oh my goodness, the layers of punishment in that game. I just can't believe people still love it. One of the classic Euro games that really comes to mind when I think about this idea of hurt feelings is the game Caelus, where players are kind of placing these buildings on this windy road, and then you've got this little provost, which is like a little sheriff on a horse, who kind of moves up and down the road, and you can kind of manipulate where that sheriff is going to be. And so by putting that sheriff in a certain spot, any other buildings which have workers on them that are after that sheriff don't get activated. And so you'll have situations where it's like, you move the provost down, now I can't activate that building's ability, so that worker was kind of used for nothing. And so you're faced with these situations where everyone's really kind of like, you know what, I'm doing this to stop you from doing that, and hey you, I don't care about your feelings, but I'm gonna do it so I can win the game. That kind of table bantering, I didn't realize how much it was infused into these very non-aggressive looking Euro classic games. I played a game of Bora Bora recently where someone placed a number 1 value die on a very important tile action. I think it was like the trade action, and everyone was like, why did you do that? You've just blocked us all out. Not to mention that you're not going to get much from it. And then they use like a card which turned that die into a value 6, which still allow them to use the 6 pips at the shop at Bora Bora, which is really powerful. And we're like, oh my goodness, how could you? But actually added to the fun, because we realized that actually was a good move. We appreciated that at our suffering, that player was actually playing well. And we could feel that feeling of playing well and being in the presence of a good play. And that was like, if I was playing this multiplayer solitaire, I wouldn't know how I was going compared to another player, other than, you know, if there was a particular goal I got before the other player. I wouldn't be able to find it until we added up our points at the end of the game to actually see who was the better player. Next thing I want to mention is probably a personal preference about what I appreciate about these older style Euros, and that is the compact nature of it. The idea that I can fit probably 6 or 7 of these on one little IKEA pigeonhole shelf, and it looks really cool with all the little books. But I think that's something that I like. It's like collecting classic novels with the classic binders and then putting them on your shelf for a display. I think I like that aesthetic about it. These games are just basically cardboard and wooden cubes, and that is it. There's no miniatures. There's if there is like a little character, they've got like a cardboard cutout with a little stand for it, and that basically is it. It's simple, it fits, it works, it's functional, it plays exactly the same. And I know there's obviously the really big deluxe version of Castle Burgundy that you can buy, and it looks grand. It looks amazing. The sculpts are like way beyond anything I would have ever imagined. But do I have a desire to own a box about this size compared to a box that is this size? I think I prefer to get a box that's this size, just because I know in my collection, I'm not fussed about miniatures, and if you love miniatures, you know, that's something that you enjoy and that's something that makes you happy. But for me, I just like owning the design of the game, having that core classic feeling to it. That's just something that brings me joy. And I can dress up the game in my own way, whether it be a platter of food or having particular wooden bowls that kind of house all of the components. And so games like Notre Dame have a very old school feel to it. You can see that there's boards with really weird shapes, but everything is cardboard. Everything's got cards, everything is kind of contained in these very simple components. And I think a lot of more modern board games do kind of go over the top and go, hey, here's the regular retail version. Now, here are all the upgraded plastic and wood and miniatures and inserts and things. And I think sometimes that goes way beyond. And I think sometimes we need to think about the environment and go, you know what? Actually, we don't need this giant plastic insert when you could just have a cardboard tuck box. Next thing about classic Euros I want to talk about is how straightforward the rules are. There are some classic Euros where the rules literally take you about 5 minutes to teach. In games like Le Havre, you basically only have 2 options on your turn. You're going to move your ship, you're going to add the resources marked on the little water tile into the resource supply areas, and then you're going to decide to either take the resources from one of those supply depots, or you're going to use the ability of a building, and then that will allow you to engage in conversion rates to get you more buildings and more ships to create food to then feed your people and earn you the most prestige. And so games like this basically just give players one decision. It means the streamlining nature of teaching game is a lot more easier. The accessibility is quite easy to get into, and the entry point is relatively low, but the reward for getting players to the table and the game to the table means that there's less overbloating, there's less teach time, and more playing the game itself. Last point I want to make about classic Euros that I've discovered is the idea that they are incredibly tight. They're incredibly restrictive. A lot of modern Euros probably have too much flexibility and too many workarounds to get to that final destination. And from one point, that expansiveness is fun to an extent where you can basically go, well, I tried this path this time, but then I can try this path this time, and then maybe the middle path the next time, and then I'll still end up at the same goal, but the journey I took to get there was different. In a lot of these classical Euros, the pathway is actually kind of the same, but the stretching and how you maneuver along that single pathway ebbs and flows, and so you are discovering how to kind of mitigate and maneuver your way down this kind of corridor to get to that goal that everyone else is kind of scrambling towards as well. And so I feel like the restrictiveness, whilst it is more distilled in these modern games, the way you get to your goal kind of gives you that very finer wiggle room compared to these other Euro games now where there's like, you get this card and this card breaks this rule and that card breaks that rule, and now you can do this and that all at the same time, and now you don't have to ignore the initial base rules at all. When you look at your board game collection or looking at the next game, are you someone who gravitates more towards the modern Euro designs, or are you someone who gravitates more towards the classic game designs, or you're someone who dabbles in both and you don't really care when the game was invented? As long as it's a good game, it has a place on your shelf. Please let me know your thoughts, opinions, and share your stories in the comment section below. I'd love to hear them and start a conversation. Now, if you really found this video super helpful, please consider subscribing and buying me a coffee a month over at my Patreon page. Otherwise, there are hundreds of other videos to check out on my main YouTube page. Feel free to browse and find something that you'll enjoy. This is Danny signing out. I hope to see you in the next video. See you soon.